Good evening. This is Mae Brown. It's KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California. It's broadcast number 673, October the 29th, 1984. I'm going to put off the Raymond Donovan Part 3 because I want to discuss our candidate, Ronald Reagan, who will become the next president of the United States in a very short time. And this saga has to do ties into the Donovan story, as you will see within a few weeks. But there was an article in the newspaper this week sharing that document of the letter of Ronald Reagan to Richard Nixon, candidate in 1960, that he should compare John Kennedy to either Karl Marx or Adolf Hitler, that triggered my thoughts about Ronald Reagan, who the real Ronald Reagan is. We've talked about it many times, but a little different approach in more detail this time. Just to update quickly what I was talking about last year. I like to do that because the year goes so fast. In the congressional records, and I wish you'd look this up and copy it, September 15th, 1983, Representative Henry Gonzalez was challenging Henry Kissinger. Who is he? He claimed that he has a State Department of his own. That is he a hired gun? Does he literally rent out the State Department? What are his goals? He is running a show that he makes appear bipartisan so that we don't have any debate, that we haven't had debate on foreign policy for 10 years since the Vietnam experiences, and that he takes control of every situation for his own good. The people hire him who have stakes in status quo, who don't care about poverty or hunger or democratic processes, which is the important part, that there's no dialogue of any kind on what is happening in this country, and he fingered Henry Kissinger. Well, Kissinger is a puppet along with Alexander Haig, and that, again, ties into my Reagan story and the succession of the presidency, the way it works. Fritz Kramer is the overlord, representing what I believe is the Fourth Reich of Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig, and these men are terribly important to the succession of power. The congressional record is available, and I have it on the other tape in case you want more of it. There's a current lawsuit going on of William Westmoreland against CBS, and there was an article it was in Spotlight, June 11th, 1984, that when CBS made the movie, the only person they permitted to defend Westmoreland was Lieutenant General Daniel Graham, who was former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, who had the honor of defending General Westmoreland on that particular program. Also, the role of Mr. Fritz Kramer, who is a partner of Daniel Graham. They share their offices in Washington, D.C., or at least one of them is a dummy front for whatever they're doing. Fritz Kramer was the man that helped Westmoreland self-destruct himself, which is an interesting thought described in a book somebody sent me, a quotation from this book. It's called Defeated Inside America's Military Machine by Stuart Lurie, L-O-O-R-Y, Random House, 1973. And this book credits Fritz Kramer as being a person behind the fragmentation of the U.S. in the war in Vietnam. Now, why would they want to fragment the war or lose the war, such a war as that, when they've made such an all-out effort? For one reason, it's a test case for how to handle the big war being the one against the Soviet Union. John Judge, who writes and does radio work back east, many of you know his work. His mother used to work in the Pentagon, and she was one of the people that helped estimate how long a war, and specifically it was the Southeast Asian War, how long it would take. And they give like a 10-year time period, and in that framework, you know how many people are going to die, how much money will be spent, what you'll have accomplished, and then you get out. So that the Vietnamese War, the South Korean War, the Middle East confrontations, and so forth are warm-ups of weapons, of how to control the media. Just as when Ronald Reagan took Grenada, he said that we couldn't have the media, such as in Vietnam. It hindered the body count. We don't want body count anymore, and the media are in the way. So based upon our experiences, and they keep going back and citing certain examples, whether it's chemical weapons or so forth in Vietnam, that new brochure that came out about instructing in El Salvador how to kill political leaders, how to create martyrs, how to use the known criminals to kill, that came from Vietnam and South Korea. It's been a handbook from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, which is the base of the Nazi criminals that were brought here to this country to form just exactly what they do, which are death squads and private armies that can take away the policy of the major army if the army doesn't want to go along with it. Then we have armed our miniature armies that are deadly and serious, and no longer does Congress have to be consulted. For example, Congress turns down Nicaragua, the money to fight Nicaragua, then they give it to the private army, the soldiers of fortune, and the mercenaries funded by the CIA and the church organizations, Reverend Moon and Pat Robertson and all the others, to make their own policy so that the private mercenaries and the ministry are funded by the intelligence community to do it anyway when Congress says you can't. Now, the thing I wanted to talk about regarding Ronald Reagan and how he got to power and the future heir to his power has to do with that letter, as I say, that he wrote in his hand to Richard Nixon in 1960. Nixon was nominated to run against John Kennedy, and Nixon was the selected heir of the Nazis, the same people that put Henry Kissinger in his uniform, that put him with the Nazis after the war, that put Fritz Kramer in as plans officer of the Pentagon. Those same people had been working with Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan all along, and at the time that Nixon is to run against John Kennedy, he has the effrontery in July 15th, 1960, to send a letter suggesting shouldn't someone tag Mr. Kennedy's new bold, imaginative program with its proper age under the tousled, boyish haircut. There's still old Karl Marx. Well, Nixon used that one with Jerry Voorhees when he ran for the House seat. He used it against Helen Douglas when he ran for the Senate. But Ronald Reagan is coaching him. Use that one. Well, hardly Karl Marx. John Kennedy's father, Joe Kennedy, was a Knight of Malta from the Vatican. He was the British ambassador, American ambassador to Great Britain, brought home because he was so pro-Hitler, pro-Nazi, that even J. Edgar Hoover brought him home so that it wouldn't call attention to our policies in the 40s, early 40s, of Joe Kennedy, working with the organized crime syndicate in Chicago and bootlegging whiskey, hardly, well, Karl Marx stuff, making a fortune of millions of dollars. So why are they comparing him to Hitler? Richard Nixon, 10 years earlier, brought Nikolai Malox of the Iron Guard to his Whittier office as a dummy front, that Western tube, and he worked with Mr. Trifia, who another acknowledged war criminal from the Iron Guard from Romania, and Otto von Bolschwing. Nixon had been working a long time with the Nazis already for how many years? This was in 1960, certainly since 1945. So what was he talking about? One, he should be Karl Marx, and the other, he should be Hitler. Reagan was writing that kind of garbage, but somebody had to be prompting him. He wasn't that smart. Why should he be tipping off the future president of the United States to use this kind of material and sign his name, Ronnie? He puts it in there. But that's the head of Ronald Reagan in 1960. I chronicled the 1960s in that article I did for Rebel magazine last November, almost a year ago. The group, the Christian Right, in 1960, that plotted the murder of Kennedy before he was going to even be elected. They wouldn't have to bother with the election. How the Christian Defense League, set up by Reverend William Gale, and he worked with Captain Robert Brown, who now runs the Soldier of Fortune magazine, who was a professional from Fort Benning, Georgia, where these death murder manuals come out of. The Christian Defense League had a man who had been trained in the Army as a colonel in the Philippines, and his superior officer was Mr. Charles Willoughby. Now, in 1960, when Young American for Freedom was formed, Charles Willoughby, and Ronald Reagan are on the board with Robert Morris, and I go into that too, the network of people that had trained in the Philippines under the Douglas MacArthur, and also Willoughby was a knighted by the Vatican, who worked with Mussolini, was proud of it, who was violently pro-fascist, whose real name was Karl Wiedenbach, who worked with MacArthur in Southeast Asia and was the link to the Christian Right that later links up with Ronald Reagan. Now, interestingly enough, in the book on Ronald Reagan that Don Freed just wrote, he tells about Dr. Loyal Davis, Nancy Reagan's stepfather, when she was Nancy Davis, before she went to Hollywood and married Ronald in 1952. Her father was in the Philippines with Charles Willoughby, violent anti-communist, and he's down there in the Philippines with Douglas MacArthur, and he comes home, and his brat daughter is sent to Hollywood to act, quotes, act, and gets Ronald Reagan in 52. 8 years later, he's to write this article to Nixon. But Nancy had latched on to Ronald Reagan at that time period, and her daddy, in addition to the Christian Defense League, was a cohort of Willoughby, and again, Willoughby in 1960 will be with Reagan, and Robert Morris, and a group that are to bring in a team that worked with the assassination of John Kennedy from Munich, Germany. So Nancy Davis, her father, was down there in the Philippines also with Mr. Willoughby, the known fascist, and I've done many broadcasts and written about Willoughby. So these links to the Philippines and to Willoughby include the Christian Right, the Christian Defense League, and this great anti-communist in Chicago who coincidentally later her daughter is to latch on to Ronnie and marry him. I don't think any of this was coincidental. I don't believe it for a minute. Now, before we get on to Ronnie and his actions in Hollywood, because preceding the time where he met Nancy, he had a very interesting career that paralleled that of Errol Flynn, who was active agent of the Gestapo, co-starring with Reagan. But because Reagan will be elected, I have to say to you, paraphrase some words of the author George Steiner, who gives Hitler a speech in his play, The Portage de San Cristobal, which explains all of us and why Ronald Reagan is possible at this time, what makes him possible. Incidentally, George Steiner, who speaks for Hitler in the play, has an interesting background. Born in Paris in 1929, parents were from Vienna, came to America in 1944, studied at University of Chicago and at Harvard, Oxford, a Rhodes Scholar, and then at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, New Jersey. He touched the bases of Mr. Kissinger and Allen Dulles, and a whole bunch of them went on to England to be an intellectual and teaches at the University of Geneva. Just a few lines from the closing of that play when Hitler is speaking, and it has to do with all of us and with the way Reagan became the president, how it's possible that he becomes president. This is Steiner speaking for Hitler, A.H. giving the speech. When I turned on the Jew, no one came to his rescue. Not one. France, England, Russia, or even Jew-ridden America did nothing. They were glad the exterminator had come. They did not say so openly, but they secretly rejoiced. We had to find and burn out that virus of utopia before the whole Western civilization got sick. To return to man as he is, selfish, greedy, short-sighted, that is the way he is. He's warm and housed, marvelously housed in his own stench. We were chosen to be the conscience of man, said a Jew. And I answered him and I said, gentlemen, you are not man's conscience, you are his bad conscience, telling us that we are so perfect, that there's a perfect world. He said, there isn't such a perfect world. You exaggerated grossly and hysterically and made me a mad devil, the quiescence of a devil hell embodied, when I was in truth only a man of my time. Oh, inspired, I grant you, with a certain, how shall I put it, a nose for supreme political possibility, a master of human moods, but a man of my time. Average, if you will. It couldn't have been otherwise. Or how could millions of ordinary men and women have found in me the mirror, the plain mirror of their needs and appetites? That's Ronald Reagan, the poor man, the father that's alcoholic, the father the Catholic, the mother the devout Christian, telling him we're born evil, there is no utopia, and life is hell, and you defend the church and send him to the Christian fundamentalist college. And Adolf Hitler, the poor boy who is brought up, who's one of the masses, who always says he hates Wall Street in his speeches and takes money under the table. And, of course, Reagan takes it over the table. It was, I allow you, an ugly time, says Hitler, through Steiner, but I did not create its ugliness, and I was not its worst. Far from it. How many wretched men of the forest did your Belgian friends murder or leave to starvation and syphilis when they raped the Congo? Answer me this, gentlemen, or do I have to remind you it was 20 million, and that picnic was underway when I was a newborn. And what about Rotterdam and Coventry compared to Dresden and Hiroshima? And he goes on, I did not come out worse in the black game of numbers. Ask the Boers in South Africa, the British in South Africa. What about Stalin, who slaughtered 30 million, he brings up. And he says, I wasn't the worst, and how many Jews did Stalin kill? And none of you talk about that. Then he says, and this is applicable to Israel and Zionism and America after the war, he says, how could Zionism spring up if it wasn't in the shape of the new German nation? He says, if we weren't so mean, if we didn't have a Holocaust, he really says, if we didn't kick ass, would it have possible for you to learn the limits of what you can do, and then you took it from there? That's paraphrasing it. He says it was the Holocaust that gave you the courage of injustice, that made you drive the Arab from his home and from his field, and live with lice eaten and without resources. You endured knowing that those that you drove out were rotting in refugee camps, not 10 miles away, buried alive in despair, with lunatic dreams of vengeance. The Holocaust was the necessary mystery before Israel could come into its strength. And ending that quote, the Holocaust was the necessary mystery before the United States government could bring in Reinhard Gehlen and Allen Dulles, could make deals with the top Nazis to build space stations and satellite stations to scorch the entire earth and bring it out. It was us, the common people, that put him in. It is the common people that put and approve of Reagan. And while people burn and die Central America close to us, we let the funds keep rolling on, the weapons go on, the napalm in El Salvador, the beheading of people, the cutting off of their genitals, the terrible quartering of people alive, burning them alive. I've put it on the air, read the text. Nobody disputes the facts, but nobody wakes up. So they learned the lesson of what we are. What we are is what we admired in Hitler. He had the nerve to do it. He had the nerve to show how mean you are. And Ronald Reagan has the nerve to show you how mean he is, and he is us. And that's what the play was about. And that's why the elections will go the way they're going to go. And Ronald Reagan will be president of the United States. If I'm wrong, that people aren't that mean and rotten, then I'll have to say, next week and plus one day, that people are nice and that Ronald was defeated. But the fact that he won't be defeated is the fact of what Steiner is saying through Hitler, that he is what people really are, and that's why they like him so much. Now to a few facts and chronologies of Ronald Reagan with Errol Flynn, because their lives were very, very close in the studio in Hollywood, the same friends in common. And you can't separate the man from what he was doing or who he was doing it with, and how Reagan's career escalated at the time it did. This is very important. In 1930, Ronald Reagan was going to a Christian college in Illinois that had 230 students. In 1932, Errol Flynn met Dr. Urban, who was very pro-German at the time when Hitler was rearming. In 1932, Flynn met Urban in 1930. In 1932, Reagan graduated from his Christian college and went to a radio station in Des Moines, Iowa. And in 1933, 1 year later, when Hitler was in power, Errol Flynn was already the ardent supporter of Adolf Hitler. In 1935 to 1937, Reagan made trips in the summer to Catalina Island. He was doing reporting for the Cubs and for the baseball games, and he said he wanted to know the players better so he could describe them. But I'm sure that the 35 to 37 years are terribly important of who he saw, what yachts came into the island, and what Reagan was doing in the summer at that time. The station he was broadcasting on combined in Des Moines, Iowa, with another station that was the affiliate of NBC, owned by General Sarnoff and RCA, which is another story of fascism. So that time period from 35 to 37, before he was picked up at Warner Brothers through one introduction, he walked in the door and one test and made his own terms. He was in Hollywood in the summer. Not many books have had those years filled in. Now, in the time period from 1937 to 1940, when just before he's to co-star with Errol Flynn in the movie Santa Fe Trail. Flynn not only was a strong supporter of Adolf Hitler, but he was helping his friend Dr. Urban escape. They knew he was a Gestapo member, the FBI knew, and the police forces that has whatever they be in the United States, they wanted to kick him out of this country. He'd been at the Spanish Civil War with Errol Flynn, spying on the Loyalists and getting the names of families whose sons were fighting in Spain, fighting against Franco. The purpose of Dr. Urban was to get the names of the families at home for Adolf Hitler, to let him know who, I suppose, could be killed or wiped out or hurt or lose their jobs in some way if their member of their family was fighting in Spain. Errol Flynn was with Dr. Urban spying on the Loyalists to send the message back to Hitler. And in this time period, as I say, in 1940, they're to make their first movie together. In this time period, Errol Flynn went to the Bahamas. He saw the Duke and Duchess of Windsor in August of 1937. Then he went to Germany and was with Adolf Hitler. Then he took Rudolf Hess and Martin Bormann, along with the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, who were then with Hitler, back from Berlin to Paris. Martin Bormann, Adolf Hitler, Rudolf Hess, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were friends. This 1941 is when Rudolf Hess is to fly out of Germany to England to the estate of a British person who was pro-Nazi. He landed within 10 miles of his estate and wanted to get the Nazis to help him fight Russia, help Hitler fight Russia. Rudolf Hess and Bormann and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor and Hitler together in 1937 period. In 1938 and 9, I'll go in details of what Errol Flynn was doing just before the movie with Ronald Reagan. And he was with Mr. Werner Gren, who was the wealthiest man in the world at the time, from Electrolux, who supplied weapons for Adolf Hitler. Sweden was neutral, so he sent them from Norway to Adolf Hitler. He had a yacht that he had down in the Bahamas that became a good part of the American history of mafia and shenanigans later that tie into Watergate. We won't digress too far. But in the Bahamas was Axel Wenner-Gren with his yacht that he bought from Howard Hughes, this luxury yacht. You would think of Hughes the recluse. Well, Hughes was in touch with Axel Wenner-Gren and all these other people at this time period. And 1937 to 1940 is the hub of the activity of Errol Flynn and Dr. Urban. And Flynn comes back to Hollywood and makes the movie Santa Fe Trail with Ronald Reagan in 1940. In September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. September 3rd, Great Britain went to war against Germany, and if Errol Flynn were in England, he would have been tried for treason for what he was doing with the Gestapo and with the top Wehrmacht officers working with the top Hitler agents in Mexico and around the world at various places in helping Dr. Urban. In the interim of 1940 to 1942, Ronald Reagan made the movie King's Row, and that gave him a stature in Hollywood he didn't have before, where later he could be picked up by General Electric, and I've done broadcasts on their merge at the top with people from IG Farben. He made a movie in 1941. His stature was up, and in 1942, he made another movie with Errol Flynn called Desperate Journey in 1942. In 1950, as I say, is when Nikolai Maloxa is to come into Richard Nixon's offices in Whittier. This is 8 years later, but they were co-starring in 1942. By 1951, Ronald Reagan was saying, I abhor communism and communist philosophy, and I'll do more on the career of Ronald Reagan. And in 1952, Reagan was running Democrats for Nixon. As early as 1952, he was for Nixon. There's 3 new books out that pertain to Nixon, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Howard Hughes, and Rudolf Hess. They won't have all the answers, but they're coming out just in a few months, or one may be out now, and they will put in some more pieces of this puzzle of the Windsors, of Hess, of Nixon. One of those books, I mentioned them briefly before, 2 of them, not the 3. One is The American Pope, The Life and Times of Francis Cardinal Spellman by John Cooney. That has to do with Spellman wanting Richard Nixon to be president and working. And again, Reagan was very political and had those inroads since 1952. He married Nancy and dating her before. The other is The Windsor Secret by Peter Allen on the role of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor with Rudolf Hess. Stories that were never told. The journey of the Duke of Windsor to Nazi Germany in 1937. That's when Errol Flynn was there with them at that time. And then it goes into what happened in 1940 and 41, turning points of the war. And in 1940 is when Flynn and Reagan are thick. And then the other book is a new book on Watergate by Michael Drosnin called Citizen Hughes. And this is about Hughes, again, who sold his yacht to Axel Wenner-Gren and his wanting Richard Nixon. And, of course, the Hughes organization was very much tied in with the Nazi organization through Karl Boyer, and I described that a year ago in my Realist article also. So their careers overlap in many ways, and I'll detail some of those for you as we go on with this saga. Now, at one time, Richard Nixon was closely tied in with Jack Ruby. In 1946, this little era, these guys are pushing for Richard Nixon to be president. In 1946, before the House Un-American activity, Richard Nixon was using Jack Ruby as a witness for him, as somebody to testify for him, and there was evidence that came out during the House hearings on assassinations. It was brought up by Mr. Trowbridge Ford, a political scientist, a member of the U.S. Army counterintelligence, and it was the links of Richard Nixon to Jack Ruby. Now, later, the organized crime syndicate would come in with Sam Giancana and John Rosselli and Carlos Marcella in the Kennedy assassination, and Ronald Reagan was close to John Rosselli. All of these names overlap Reagan, Nixon, and the connections of the Hollywood crowd, the people behind the careers of Nixon and Reagan, overlap with the mafia, the Nazi, and the Vatican, with Spellman and the Pope and the Vatican connections, and then the Nazi connections, very active in Hollywood. I don't think many people realize how active they were. Now, in the 1950s, E. Howard Hunt was working in the CIA as a liaison to Richard Nixon, advising him on matters of John Kennedy and what John Kennedy was going to do, and he was a CIA officer in South America, E. Howard Hunt was, and later he will tie in to the Young Americans for Freedom that William Buckley set up, and again with Willoughby and Reagan on the board, and a lot of the Hollywood heavies on the board of Young Americans for Freedom. Mr. John Rousselet from the John Birch Society, and Mrs. Eli Lilly, as I say, Robert Morris, Mrs. Taylor Caldwell, she's on the Western Goals, the Los Angeles Police Department, links to the computers in Washington. When Ronald Reagan was asked to be on the board, one of the founders of Young Americans for Freedom in 1960, with people like Charles Willoughby and Professor Hans Senholz from Western Goals, his reputation and links to John Singlaub and the World Anti-Communist League and William Buckley and George Murphy and Robert Morris, he was selected by the really heavy fascists, the people that were setting up the hot war, the Cold War, whatever you want. A lot of links to that biblical Christian right, all of them, either the Vatican or the far, far right wing that is appearing now. Reagan's work, his career, had a lot to do with a preparation and the time period that he was co-starring, as I say, with Errol Flynn, I think is very, very important, considering how active Errol Flynn was. Now, at this time period, the world was run in the 30s and 40s and up till 1945 by Mussolini and Franco and Hirohito and Adolf Hitler. And the bankers from England and America and the Swiss banks, major banks in the world, were funding Adolf and used John McCloy. If you read the book Trading with the Enemy by Charles Hyam, who also wrote the one on Errol Flynn and the Nazis, they didn't put this country, this massive, huge country with its resources, its wealth, its breadth, in the hands of an actor. They didn't just choose a man who made a couple of good movies and you have his sympathy because his legs have been cut off, or General Electric Theater. That wasn't why he was in politics, and everything he's done since that day is consistent with what they wanted him to do. In the book, The Secret Life of Ronald Reagan, that Don Freet wrote, it's page 10 where it says that Dr. Loyal Davis, who was battling socialized medicine of any kind, was in the Far East during the war. He was a friend of General Douglas MacArthur and his chief of intelligence, Charles Willoughby, and those stalwarts alerted him to the loss of China to the Reds, and now back in Chicago, he was an activist in the anti-communist cause. And so when Nancy goes out to Hollywood, Daddy has spent time with Mr. Willoughby, and goodness knows if they met after that or how often. And also in the book on page 12 are the quotations of Ronald Reagan being very close to John Rosselli, that he was a notorious gangster and they intended to terrorize the strike leaders in Hollywood if there were strikes. Reagan met Rosselli often in the studio lawyers, and they were such good friends for years after that they would meet at the Friars Club, John Rosselli. After John Rosselli testified to the House Select Committee on his role and participation, or hinted if not directly, in the murder of John Kennedy, he was found dead, cut up, and put in a drum, meant not to surface, I suppose, hands and legs cut off outside of Miami. That was at the time the committee was doing their investigation. We'll take a 1-minute break and then go on with Errol Flynn and Ronald Reagan for the second half of this broadcast. This is Mae Brown, and it's program number 673, October the 29th, 1984. Just citing some chapters in Ronald Reagan's life to show the escalation of his career. I call it a coup d'etat in this country. Evans and Novak call it a Reagan Revolution. It was really a revolution to fascism, the way it slid in, but they describe in a book that I just read this weekend the career of Ronald Reagan and a few turning points in his life that are pertinent to the way America is going now, and they're the ones who tell that the WHO station in Des Moines merged with the NBC station, and how Reagan went to Santa Catalina Island and made trips, several such trips, and in 1937, before the Cubs went home, he decided to, he wanted to go into acting, met a woman named Joy Hodges who took him to William Meiklejohn, and the arrangements were made, the contract was made for him to begin right away at Warner Brothers, and they say, Evans and Novak, that no previous president of the United States had so bizarre a preparation for political office. And you might say in Nazi Germany, with all the heads of states of Europe, that no previous leader had so bizarre a preparation for office as Adolf Hitler. They said Reagan alone among recent presidents without benefit of special education or capital resources went from town to town and parlayed his intelligence and talent. Well, he only had to ask one person in Hollywood, Joy Hodges, who was singing at the Biltmore Bowl, I'd like to be an actor. And he all of a sudden is drawing $500 a week at Warner Brothers, and then goes to General Electric Theater and becomes the governor of California with so little knowledge or expertise, and then the president of the United States. All the doors seemed to be open for him, and he seemed to be the right person. Evans and Novak say that starting in 1937, Reagan's liberalism was limited in those days. He was appalled at the taxes taken by the government, and he objected to the graduate income tax. This is in 1937. He didn't like taxes on the government, and the quotation, I abhor the communist philosophy, came out in 1951. And his relationship to Nancy Davis is described with the multimillionaire surgeon, militant conservative Republican, but he doesn't say in this book, it's from the other book, the relationship of Dr. Loyal Davis to Willoughby down in the Philippines. This career of Reagan becomes more political and more radical. By 1952, he was a Democrat for Eisenhower. In 1960, the Democrat for Nixon. Oh, I thought 52 was reversed. I had the dates wrong. He was Democrat for Nixon in 60. Then became a Republican and joined the General Electric circuit and got to get known around the state and around the country, of course, the national circuit. But then it said Reagan joined the grassroots revolt of the Republican Party workers, who in 1964 destroyed decades of Eastern establishment control over the party's national machinery. In 1964, he grabbed control over what was the Eastern party's national machinery. When John Kennedy was murdered in 1963, that is when we had the coup. And by 1964, decades of work by the Eastern establishment were done in, and Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon then would be in control of the White House from then on. It tells about Mr. Holmes Tuttle, a millionaire Ford dealer. You have to go back to the massive program of Henry Ford with Adolf Hitler during the entire war, up to it and afterwards, supplying them with tanks and violently anti-Semitic literature. Mr. Holmes Tuttle was one of the people with behind Ronald Reagan, and also an A.C. Rubel and Henry Salvatore. And I'll go back more into Salvatore later, handpicked by Patrick Frawley, a Knight of Malta, who introduced Salvatore to Ronald Reagan. And the links to the Kennedy assassination, I'll do an entire broadcast on that soon. I've done some of it before. They turned him over to Stu Spencer and Bill Roberts, the managers of his speeches, and they told him his rhetoric had to be soft to get elected. And in this book of Evans and Novak, they said the first sign that was followed by many, many more of years was that Reagan would do whatever was needed to win. Whether he diluted his rhetoric or dropped his old friends, he used the Spencer-Roberts guideline. He had a limited denunciation of the John Birch Society while he expanded his links with them. And he would say, what they're saying is anything he wanted to say while the Reagan Revolution rolled on. It also tells about the role of Alexander Haig coming into the Reagan White House when he was president, and how Haig's big shtick was to go into the subject of terrorism, which is what George Shultz is going to do now, to set up our death squads officially on the books, and how he worked with Haig worked with his friend Claire Sterling, an esteemed foreign correspondent based in Rome. Haig working closely, he's a Knight of Malta, and we're closing with P2 and Licio Gelli and the team that wanted a military coup in Italy, a fascist coup, whereas we had one here that quietly slipped by without too many people noticing. And Haig working with Claire Sterling, sitting outside the White House prior to when the oath of office was taken by the president, getting ready to spring all of this, even before his confirmation hearings. He had studies from Stanford and from Rome, from Claire Sterling, his friend, to begin the terrorism shtick. And, of course, the CIA and other parts of the government and the P2 set up the bread brigades and the terrorists as an excuse to close down on the terrorists, like they did in the United States with the SLA. As far as the Christian right and the fundamentalists, this book by Evans and Novak, talking about Reagan's Revolution, talks about Paul M. Weyrich, W-E-R-I-C-H. You've seen him lately, or a lot in the news. And Richard Vagary from Young Americans for Freedom. We're going now to 1980, and Reagan's in the White House. And Mr. Weyrich is the person escalating this 1984 election along with Vagary. They combine their talents, and he describes Weyrich in those days when Reagan came in 1980 as a 37-year-old political organizer who flew from Washington but was no preacher. He wasn't even a Protestant. He was born and raised a Roman Catholic. He joined the Eastern Rite Catholic Church when Rome liberalized their liturgy. He was so rigid in his theology. And 6 years earlier, before he helped Reagan in 1980, he was financed by Joseph Kerr, the beer baron and the conservative activist from Golden, Colorado. Money was put into Weyrich's hand to form the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, a new right political action group to finance and organize conservative campaigns starting in 1979, so eventually the new right can throw out all the liberal congressmen and fascism will be elected in 1984 by 1988, just as Hitler got elected in 1933, a continuous route of people with the same links or goals. So by 1979, they were running out for the 1980 elections, people like Senator Frank Church, who opened up the mind control programs and the assassination teams of the CIA and so forth. They get a good job of cleaning out Congress, and they'll do better this next week. So Weyrich was funded by Joseph Kurz. He was a rigid, devout Catholic, and what he did was he took his money south and went to the born-again pastors. He went to the pastor of the huge Forest Hills Baptist Church in Decatur, Georgia. Mr. Pinnell had passively supported a Georgian, the born-again Christian, Jimmy Carter, and also running against him was George born-again Christian John Anderson. And to the fundamentalists, they gave a lot of money. They would say that the Satan abroad was a godless communism in Moscow. These were their quotes. And Satan was in the form of anti-family and drugs and pornography. And so Reagan came in on every one of these issues with a clean slate, and Reagan became the man of faith. So Mr. Paul Weyrich, from Rome, a devout Catholic, funded by Mr. Coors with the money, could go down to the fundamentalist Christian churches and to Congress and organize the committees to get into Congress the people and the appointments they wanted. And along with that revolution, they call it a Reagan Revolution, and it goes way, way back, comes Mr. Richard Vagary. He came out directly out of the Young Americans for Freedom, the Willoughby Morris Buckley Reagan group of conservatives, and they combined, and according to Evans and Novak, the way that Reagan got in before was a combination of the Young Americans for Freedom, organizers, fundraisers such as Richard Vagary and Howard Phillips, and especially Paul Weyrich of the conservative right, working with and bringing up the prominence of the electronic church. There was a lot of news coverage this past week on the tribulation and the electronic church and the beliefs of the millennium and so forth. I'm not going into those now, but these things were funded by the Vatican and Mr. Coors through Weyrich and his organization, clinging Congress and setting up the churches, and Young Americans for Freedom with their computers, working with people like Reverend Moon and the organizations that create CAUSA, that support the Contras down in Central America or down in Paraguay, Uruguay, Mexico. Moon has his own armies, and that money came through Young Americans for Freedom and through William Buckley and the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, this book tells about the new breed of electronic preachers. They abandoned the rhetorics of their pioneer, the Reverend Billy Graham, who was put in by Luce and William Randolph Hearst, and they went on their own. The Reverend James Robeson in Dallas, and he's the one who gave the opening invocation at the Republican Convention. He preached a politically muscular Christianity. The Reverend Pat Robertson, the son of the late Senator A. Willis Robertson of Virginia, was another one of the electronic preachers. Pat Robertson was on TV this week on Phil Donahue, telling how he works for W.R. Grace and Company. He's a lawyer from Yale, and he is probably the richest and strongest outside of Jerry Falwell. And then they describe Jerry Falwell in this book and his lunge into politics, the Reverend Jerry Falwell of Lynchburg, Virginia, who was attracted, when the book was written, $12 million from his old-fashioned gospel hour, and the basis of the moral majority was the Reverend Bob Billings along with Falwell. So you have Mr. Weyrich with strong religious backgrounds getting into politics, clinging up the Congress, clinging up the White House candidates, writing the platform for the Republican Party and spreading their gospel at the same time. And this goes back to the intent of what would happen had Hitler lost the war, the Nazis go underground, and the Martin Bormann money, and the continuous links into people like Ronald Reagan, who started with a background of people going to the fascism of Willoughby, to Loyal Davis, to Nancy Davis. Those are not coincidences. Or the Christian right, they involve Lauren Hall or William Seymour, and people wanted for the assassination of John Kennedy, and Ronald Reagan won't extradite Mr. Bradley to the trial of Jim Garrison. Then also in this book on the New Revolution, there's an interesting point here, how they bring in Al Haig, and Al Haig thinks that, like with John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, that he's going to run the whole Department of Foreign Policy. And the conflict that came in, he thought he would be the vicar of Washington. Remember when Ronald Reagan was shot and he got up and said he was the vicar? And this tells about the fighting going on between Haig, because he was so big and he thought of himself as being virtually the second president for foreign policy, that he would take over and make the decisions, and that his delusions of this power were nurtured so much that they described the problem of putting him down. But this book goes on to say that Mr. Meese, Edwin Meese, trained to honor the staff system through long experience with Ronald Reagan, because Edwin Meese is holding the fort for those old-timers, not the Haig Kissinger yet. Haig isn't in charge yet. He's holding the line Mies was trained to hold this line with Ronald Reagan and with Mr. Baker, was guarding against any personality cult that might weaken George Bush, the heir apparent, so they had to cut down Haig. Haig was cut out in June 82 from this group. His friend Kissinger still running it, but the heir apparent is announced right here, and you can look for that. And if you see pictures of Ronald Reagan falling on the steps or sounding like his mind is wandering, he can go anywhere he wants 8 days from now, because heir apparent is sitting there in vice president, and the agency he was the head of, the CIA, was formed by Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, another Knight of Malta from the Vatican, and James Angleton, another Knight of Malta from the Vatican, so that they tried to cut him down and separate Haig from the power in the White House, because the next heir apparent happens to be George Bush. Now, those are a few statements from the book, The Reagan Revolution by Evans and Novak, and the remaining 10 minutes, I'm going into a little more about where Errol Flynn was at the time that he was operating and making movies. Very important. If I don't cover it all, I'll pick up some of it next week. Maybe I can talk fast and do the rest of it in 10 minutes. We'll see. But I'm going to read you sections, and you may have the book. If you don't have, get it. From Errol Flynn, The Untold Story by Charles Hyam. It was published in 1980. It's a paperback, and you can get it from Research up in Capitol. I'll give you the address, or Aptos. The Untold Story by Charles Hyam of Errol Flynn. And I'm just going into a few space periods of where he was prior to and when he was making movies with Ronald Reagan. And don't tell me that the entire Defense Department, the space stations, the astronauts that are up there brought in by the Nazis that were war criminals, and the Project Paperclip, all the expertise of this country would allow Ronald Reagan to make decisions for those people if he wasn't screened out before he met Nancy Davis and before he escalated on his career. Now, here's a few quotations from the book. I'll jump around. They aren't all in consecutive order. Just where Flynn was. In March 1928, during the last week of his making the movie Four's a Crowd, his friend Urban, who was a member of the Gestapo at the time, returned from a trip to the Orient. He went to San Pedro. Immigration inspectors threatened to arrest Urban. Urban lied that Errol Flynn lied that he didn't know where Urban was. He was a close friend of his. They'd been friends for 8 years at that point. So Errol quickly helped him get on his yacht and take him to Mexico. Urban dodged them and sailed to Mexico and the Panama Canal. This was before the yacht, on the SS Triton. He traveled to New York in April of 38, and he got himself into a meeting of the reunion of the Lincoln Brigade of American supporters, the Loyalists. Then he reported to the Nazi spy group who was at the meeting. Then he went to the Nazi German consulate in New York in the Black Shirt Nazi dinner in Yonkers on April 21st to celebrate the birthday of Adolf Hitler. It was at 85th Street Meeting Hall of the German-American Bund. 4 days later, he was at the Passport Division, and he was questioned, and they saw his Nazi documents, and he was very bold. He boasted about his Nazi sons. He showed pictures of them in uniform. And while he was gone, this is in 1938 period, Austria was annexed by Hitler. At that point, Urban was issued a Nazi card dated May 1st, 1938, waiting for him in Munich, and they were going to send it to New York for him, but it hadn't arrived yet at that time. But he was a full-fledged member of the Nazi Party. He applied to work at the Civilian Conservation Corps in the United States, which was training civilians in case of war, and then as a camp doctor, and he was at Fort Moultrie in South Carolina, talking about Gestapo philosophy and praising Adolf Hitler. Then he was sent to the Civilian Conservation Corps in Sebring, Florida, and he could take photographs of methods, installations, guns, and weapons, and discuss Nazis openly at that place at the CCC. And the efforts to revoke his citizenship began to be reactivated. He had been made a citizen in the United States, just as I said Joseph Mengele was and is, and that hasn't been revoked yet. They even talked about that, and that's controversial. Now, Errol Flynn, in late 1940, Errol comes to the aid of Dr. Urban aboard Sirocco, Sirocco, in the fall of 1940 and early winter. Noticing that Urban's case was received by the German consul, Fritz Wiedemann, that they were on his tail and that Errol Flynn was going to help him because The powers that be knew he was a Nazi spy. The German consul general in San Francisco and George Geisling, Gysssling, the German consul in L.A., got in touch with Dr. Urban, asked him to join the Abwehr, the German military intelligence in Mexico City, and train in microdot and microfilm techniques, which he later does. And then he was transferred to the Orient, where he was a founding member of the Nazi spy ring in Shanghai, and worked with another well-known New York journalist named Hans Adolf Mossberg, who happened to be a Jew, and they gave him honorary Aryan in return for his services to Adolf Hitler. There was no problem for them. At that point, he was traveling abroad, and later Errol Flynn helped him go to Mexico. He couldn't get in the United States. The FBI's failure to find Dr. Urban and Errol Flynn shows how bad they were working at the time. I don't think the FBI wanted to find them. And at the time Charles Hyam wrote this in 1980, he's giving them credit for trying and not doing it. It says, according to W.E. Williamson, one of the leading figures in military intelligence in Asia under General Douglas MacArthur, military intelligence was aware of Urban's connections and Errol Flynn's connections all along. Now, the chief of intelligence of Douglas MacArthur was Charles Willoughby, and under him was Colonel Williamson. So Errol Flynn and Dr. Urban were working with Williamson and Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines. Dr. Loyal Davis is down in the Philippines with Douglas MacArthur and Mr. Willoughby, and goes back to Chicago. Now, Errol Flynn goes from there to Hollywood and is co-starring in 1940 and 1942 with Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan is going to marry the daughter of a man who was down there with Urban and Errol Flynn. This gets a little too close to the relationship of this pro-Mussolini Willoughby to being on the Young Americans for Freedom with Reagan, Errol Flynn and Urban working with Willoughby and Williamson in the Philippines with Douglas MacArthur, and Loyal Davis and Nancy, lo and behold, arrives in Hollywood. Now, this story, according to Charles Hyam, and I think he was more naive in 1980 than 1984, tells about how Errol Flynn went to Spain with Dr. Urban. They were traveling a while back, and the British intelligence had wanted him. I'm not sure how much they wanted him. Again, the FBI. He says they wanted him. They would have asked why Flynn paid Urban's legal fees, gave him shelter when Flynn's country was at war with Germany, and why he aided and abetted Dr. Urban by helping him get aboard vessels, and invited Urban's Nazi sons to stay at his home, and why he hid Urban on his yacht while Britain was fighting their enemy, Nazi Germany. Now, when Mr. Fritz Kramer was put in the American Army uniform, the books on Fritz Kramer, the article by Nick Themisch in the Washington Post said his brother was wanted as a Nazi in Great Britain and held there while Fritz Kramer came to America and put on American uniform. Now, to go on with this as much as we have time to, in Mexico City, Urban reported to the Consul General von Wallenberg at the Gestapo headquarters, located strangely enough in a former convent, where Urban was given intensive spy work in microdotting. Then, with a forged German passport under the alias Alois Ecker, E-C-K-E-R, the ship's musician, he sailed to Los Angeles in February. He used the name Ecker because it was a friend of his in Vienna. Errol Flynn was in Honolulu as a guest of Captain James Robb of Pearl Harbor Naval Base, taking films and photographs and notes. Now, this is the time period when he's going to make a movie. Pearl Harbor is going to come shortly after that. They're down there in the 40s, just before the attack on Pearl Harbor, and they are assisting in taking pictures. In 1943, Errol Flynn claimed he didn't know about what was going on in Japan, but Urban was with Errol Flynn taking pictures. Errol was Honolulu, and Jack Warner cabled him. He wanted him to appear in a picture called Dive Bomber that would illustrate the problems of Naval Air Corps flyers during their intensive training. Navy intelligence records showed that Urban, Errol Flynn's friend, was active with Nazis in South America, and they were reluctant to put him on the sets of the San Diego Naval Base or to go to Japan, and Jack Warner, through his personal troubleshooter, Colonel William Guthrie, coaxed Washington So great was the power of Hollywood studios that the Secretary of the Navy overruled the others and ordered the San Diego Navy base to put at Warner Brothers' disposal. This is in 1941. They made the movie Dive Bomber with graphic portrayal of secret installations and aircraft carrier decks, and they were shipped, as Errol undoubtedly hoped, directly to Japan. The films were shipped to Japan. Some more on this book. They died with their boots on. This is a movie that Errol Flynn made in this period. They died with their boots on. Errol was frequently in Mexico. The FBI agents traced him there. He mingled with an extraordinary group of expatriates, including, this is in 1941. He made his first movie with Ronald Reagan in 40, and now in 41 they are separated until they get back in 42. So this is the year between movies. Errol Flynn is with FBI agents, have trailed him everywhere. He's with expatriates and Gestapo and Abwehr. By that period, 700 Nazi agents poured into Mexico from the United States, Japan, Central America, and Spain. In her brilliant book covering the Mexican front, Washington Post correspondent Betty Kirk wrote, these agents were prepared for the Axis conquest of Mexico. Germans were on the streets, in cafes, bars, and nightclubs. They rang out at cocktail bars, yelling, "Death to the Jew, Roosevelt. Germany's coming victory will be very soon," and they talked about the coming victory. Errol's most frequent visits were to the apartment of George Nicholas, Nicolaus, of the Nazi Party, and his associate Hans Hellermann. Errol and Urban's Gestapo contact in Barcelona, and every day they were guarded night and day by the German and Mexican police so they would be safe. And from Mexico, this is in 1941, Errol flew to the Bahamas in early October, the guest of Axel Wenner-Gren, the Swedish creator of Electrolux, estimated at $1 billion wealth, then probably the wealthiest man in the world. From there, he made his money through the munitions he sent to Hitler. From there, they went to visit Goering. They arranged for Hitler to see Errol Flynn. He saw Errol Flynn. And this is the story of Errol Flynn going with his close friend to Germany from Nassau and into Europe to visit. Werner Gren was above the law, above international law. When Errol arrived by Werner Gren's private plane, he was greeted by his host at Nassau with the good news that he would be on the yacht, the Southern Cross, bought from Howard Hughes for $1 million with hand-picked Nazis on the staff of the finest chefs on Werner Gren's yacht. Werner Gren introduced Errol to the multimillionaire Canadian Sir Harry Oakes, who is later to be murdered, and that's another long broadcast or two. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor, who shared their admiration for Hitler. He was in ideal company. Errol Flynn spent 2 weeks with them at Cuernavaca, and then he goes on and he has his relationship going with the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. He had been in Nazi Germany and Rudolf Hess and was on the yacht with Werner Gren. Now, this is the time period, as I say, that he is making movies in between and with Ronald Reagan. Now, because of the common Philippines connections and the studio connections and the intrigue and persuasiveness of Errol Flynn and Dr. Urban, I believe that, and the way that Ronald Reagan is picked up by General Electric with their close affiliations with I.G. Farben and his friend Mr. Tuttle with the Ford Motor Company, Reagan was hand-picked all along. I believe the contacts at Catalina Island were the first clue. He's moving right into a contract at Warner Brothers, incidentally, and not separately from it. Errol Flynn lived through this whole time period at 601 Walden Drive, and my parents' home is about 7 houses away from there. There's 615, one street north of or west of that, and there, if you walk down 5 houses and then to the left, it's where Errol Flynn lived during all this Gestapo period when I was going to Beverly High. And I also was very close to the family of Jack Warner. Jack Warner and my parents were good friends, and they were staunch members of our congregation, very religious people. And Jack Warner's niece, Evelyn Halpert, was his sister's daughter, was my best friend through those years when I went to high school. And we saw a lot of these personalities at the Warner home, and I was in and out of those homes at that time period and totally not aware of anything that was going on. And then Evelyn married my second husband about 1972-73, the niece of Jack Warner, and Jack Warner knew that Errol Flynn was working in the Gestapo and didn't want it known because it wouldn't sell movies. That's why I say the role of none of these people is pure or good. That's why that play of Mr. Steiner's is so great, because the Jews of Hollywood, Louis Mayer and Jack Warner, two people that were very close to my parents that I grew up around and with, never breathed a word about Hitler and wanted Hitler to win. Secretly, we never heard that Nazi was bad, and to this day, you can't say among that circle anything about Nazis. You can talk about Holocaust, period, but not about Nazis. And that is the brilliance of the playwright, because in all of this milieu of these people brewing, hundreds of them in Hollywood, having celebrations in Mexico because Hitler is going to win and continue this Holocaust, these men working, Santa Fe Trail was the movie that Errol Flynn made with Ronald Reagan, and it was well known that through the circles around Hollywood of Errol Flynn's link to the Gestapo. And Reagan describes in the movie, in the book that Charles Hyam did, I made Santa Fe Trail with Errol Flynn, and he tells that he wanted a job interrogating a Gestapo chief, and he was mad because Flynn took the scene and Reagan wanted it, but Errol Flynn wanted that scene, and so it was his. But the story of the elections this next week and forevermore is the story of us. It is the story of looking the other way. All this material is public domain. I didn't make it up, and it's there for you to see. And it is the American tragedy. It's what Evans and Novak called the American Revolution. It is a revolution of the right, and the only blood that spilled were the witnesses to the assassination and the political leaders that would have stood in the way, such as Adlai Stevenson, Hubert Humphrey, even Nelson Rockefeller, anyone, Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy, anybody that was in the way of these people. The power was made a long time ago. The decisions were made, I believe, for Reagan in Illinois, and for Nixon when he got out of the Navy, and the road was cleared for them to bring in the Fritz Kramers and the Kissingers and the Haigs and George Bush, the selected heir, the former director of the CIA. Well, that's enough for now. I will not do too much on the election next week. I may just, I don't know what I'll do. That's 7 days away. We'll see what happens. Take care. This is Mae Brown. I'll be back with you next week, and this is from Pacific Grove, California.